Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all for joining us today for this version of the CEDAR Virtual Policy Forum on computational regulation, from policy sludge to smarter rules, in collaboration with RegGenome. My name is Siddharth Shetty. I'm the CEO of Internet Labs and a co-founder of the Cambridge Digital Innovation and Regulation Initiative known as CEDAR. Regulatory frameworks have expanded dramatically over the past 2 decades, layering often inconsistent and overlapping requirements on top of old and legacy ones. This is what the Asian Development Bank, in a recently published research paper, calls policy sludge. The sludge is a burden on firms, a drag on competitiveness, and growth of economies from across the world. It is also a problem that computational regulation, by making rules legible to machines, may help us address, especially as we move into a more agentic economy. As technology infrastructure becomes central to financial services, and as geopolitical tensions permeate regulatory discussions around the world, the question of whether computational regulation can support competitiveness and cross-border cooperation rather than fragmentation is timely and well aligned with the mission of CEDAR. The promise of computational regulation, however, needs to be considered in balance with the risks. Preserving human judgment and accountability that regulation depends on is a challenge and one of the central questions that we will be discussing today. To start us off, we will begin with a presentation of the research findings by Michael Shu, a fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School, former acting comptroller of the currency from the United States, and one of the co-authors of the paper, Simplifying Compliance, Cleaning Up Policy Sludge with Trained AI Tools. After that, we will move to a debate moderated by Gillian Tett, and I will say more about it in a few minutes. For now, let me pass the virtual mic to Michael. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks so much, Siddharth. I'm really pleased to be here to present this, and it should be acknowledged there's some co-authors that are going to be joining us on the panel. So if we can go to the next slide. The first question is, what is policy sludge? And there are a lot of definitions out there. The definition we used in the paper was, as you described, Siddharth, the accumulation of overlapping, inconsistent, outdated, and fragmented statutes, rules, and supervisory expectations. And as was alluded to, this has a lot of costs. It adds unnecessary compliance burdens, which a lot of regulated institutions can attest to. It obscures real risks. It can really mislead and distort as to what the real risks are. And the unspoken and implicit cost is that it drains scarce resource capacity from regulators and regulated institutions. Now, not all policy sludge is equal. In the paper, we described three types, and there's at least three. But the first is what we call horizontal sludge. And this really is about rules or expectations or statutes that are parallel to each other, but they overlap in what they require, what they request. This happens a lot with reporting, reg reporting. Helen Packard's going to be joining us on the panel. The UK FCA has some excellent analysis and reports of overlapping reporting regimes for derivatives. It's kind of like a Venn diagram where they ask for essentially the same thing or similar things, and that can be lead to a lot of sludge. The second type is vertical sludge, and this really got highlighted at a conference in Tokyo where talking through, there may be a statute that then leads to a regulation, which then leads to reporting requirements, which then leads to reporting instructions, supervisory handbooks, policies within institutions. And as you move down this stack, new things get added as you go down. And a great example, I was just at a conference about third-party risk management, is that the expectations for third-party risk management is pretty straightforward. However, as it gets implemented, and as a lot of vendors know, you get these really long questionnaires that ask lots and lots and lots of questions. And that's an example of how things get added and can create sludge. And finally, there's cumulative sludge. And this is the kind of thing that just builds over time. And I recently did some research on bank board of director duties, where every time there's a new rule, you just throw in there, hey, the board shall or the board should. And if you add those up over time, that can add up to quite a bit. And comprehensively, no one has a really clear, comprehensive picture of it. It just accumulates like barnacles on a ship or layers of paint in an apartment. So next slide, please. Why is sludge in focus now? And there's a bunch of different reasons for this, but we think it really boils down to four. The first is that the volume and complexity of regulation has undeniably increased. And if you look at any metric, especially post 2008 financial crisis, there were a lot of rules that were put in place. And those rules have to get implemented, and there's a lot of reporting. And each one of those is easily justified. I mean, I and others on this panel have had a role in drafting and implementing some of those. It's the accumulative effect that leads to a lot of sludge. Second, there are a lot of growth and competitiveness concerns, and that's across nations globally, which is putting a lot of pressure on regulators to simplify or deregulate. And I think that is a shared sense globally. Third, agencies are reevaluating what policy effectiveness is. And in the US, this takes the form of a stronger focus on outcomes versus process. There are variants of this globally. And then fourth, and this is the really hard one, I think Siddharth had referred to this, national and regional priorities are driving fragmentation. And this leads to a lot of sludge. One of the examples that was highlighted in Tokyo was cyber. In cyber, every authority, every jurisdiction wants control because they feel a great degree of responsibility. But if they want control, that leads to a lot of duplicative requests for firms and institutions that operate globally. And so there's a real tension there that gets highlighted by those national and regional priorities. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here, we're looking for some feedback. And there's a poll. If you take out your phones or scan that QR code, we want to ask you, what do you think, which policy sludge most urgently needs addressing today? Now that you know what it is, you have a sense of what the contours of it are. Here are some choices. You can pick more than one. I think you can pick up to three. Is it reg reporting? I kind of talked through the example with derivatives, but there's lots of different reg reporting out there. I hear all the time from bankers that they have to fill the same thing out 15 different ways, which leads to a lot of wasted effort. Or is it capital and liquidity requirements? There was a stress testing conference, I think a year and a half ago, where one of the CFOs said, with Basel 3.5, it's like we've just layered on paint after paint after paint in the New York apartment, and we just kind of lost the thread as to what are we trying to do here, which caught a lot of people's attention, resonated with a lot of folks. Is it anti-financial crimes compliance? Like, this is one where I think everyone agrees that the cost benefit of how the regime is operating is not optimal. Firm level governance, that refers to things like board of director duties, management requirements, et cetera. You've got cyber IT operational resilience. Again, I gave that example. And then with consumer protection, that's another area where at least I've heard a lot of complaints about policy sludge. Okay, so hopefully folks have had a chance to get into the Slido. And after you vote, we will compile those and talk about those during the panel discussion. Next slide, please. Okay. Once you identify sludge, how hard is it to clean up? And the short answer is it's very hard if you're going to do it manually. So on the left, we have this example from the Reserve Bank of India. Last year, they announced that they were going to consolidate over 9,000 circulars, which are essentially guidance documents, into 244 master directions. And they were very explicit about doing that in a neutral manner. They were not going to create any new obligations and not destroy any obligations. It took them reportedly more than 40 people over a year to accomplish that. If you're running an agency, that's an entire department. That is extremely intensive to accomplish. There's another example from here in DC. In 2016, the DC Council wanted to revise the criminal code, which had not been revised since 1901. So there was an accumulation of a lot of criminal statutes they wanted to clean up. They created a commission. It took over 5 years, lots of hearings, lots of reports, so this is a very manually intensive effort. I have myself been part of a very narrow slice that took a team of a dozen, about several months, to accomplish some modest sludge identification. So this is exactly the kinds of things that AI can help with, but LLMs are not great at reading statutes, and there's some great research on this. Stanford's got some research on this. Bob's Reg Genome has done some great research on this, and you can see this in some of the scores. But there is hope. Specially trained and specially harnessed AI systems can attack this in a more reliable, repeatable, credible way. Next slide, please. Okay, let's just assume for a moment that we clean up the sludge. How do we prevent it from rebuilding? Like, is this the kind of thing where it's like repainting a bridge? You just have to constantly do it, or not? And so here's 3 suggestions. One is, if there's an annual sludge identification assessment process, then that's one way of just building it in. It's almost like maintenance. It's like taking your car in to get it fixed every once in a while, to do that on a cycle. The second, and this is where computational regulation comes in, is to really do much more in the space of machine readable, machine consumable, machine executable rules, and to publish those by default. All rules today, most are published as PDFs. That leads to a lot of replication, reinterpretation, and that contributes to the sludge, as we'll talk about in a second. Like, making that machine readable and machine executable can really cut down on. And third is for the drafters, the people who write the reg, who are actually typing out the regs and the rules and the statutes, is that it's possible to build policy development environments, drafting environments, where as they do that, they can see both the sludge being identified. Imagine if there's like a sludge co-pilot as they're drafting that to say, hey, you already asked for that in these other statutes, these other regs, as well as building in a machine readable component to that. So if you can, we do a couple of more detailed examples. Next slide, please. This schematic is from Reg Genome and Cambridge, which really just kind of lays out, we've got human readable regulation on the bottom. And as we build towards machine readable, machine consumable, machine executable, that's the direction of travel. It does require quite a bit of work. And I think that that's one of the great projects that we can all be working on. Next slide, please. This is from a presentation I gave at the Open Source Finance Forum recently in London. Same idea, but here it's, if you go to the left, this is kind of the current state where you've got a statute and you've got a regulation, and then each of these verticals is a different firm. They reinterpret the statute, they come up with their own data schemas, they come up with their own rule logic, and that's how you get the report. In the derivative space, Finos, which open source group, they've created a common data scheme, CDM, and a common rules logic. ISDA has that, and that's shared. And so what that does, that starts to cut down on some of the fragmentation there. Now, if you move all the way to the right, if the authority were to issue the regulation as code, as machine readable, then these really start to plug in, and you get an entire stack where the thing that's unique to the firm is unique to the firm, everything else is shared. And that really cuts things down and can make things more efficient. Next slide, please. And this is just a snapshot of the policy development environment. Full disclosure, I just vibe coded this, but the idea was that if you have the drafting environment on the left, this is for, you have to think about your policy analyst, your reg reporting, or your reg drafter. They write in prose, right? This is a snapshot of the Basel III rule in the US. Imagine they're writing that, and as they're drafting that, in the middle panel, the structure of the statute is made very, very clear. It's automated, it's automatically populated for structure, so you get cross references. All conflicts are identified. Policy sludge is identified in real time. And on the right, it just automatically translates it into machine readable forms, JSON, XML, Markdown, so that the drafter can see it all at one time. And you can see it all in one place. It's all synced up. The coders can go to the right, the drafters can go to the left. I think these are the kinds of innovations that are going to be necessary to really push this forward. So with that, let's see if the poll results. Next slide, please. So that's the end of the presentation. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and hopefully we have some poll results to discuss. I'll turn it back to Siddharth and Jillian.
Thank you for the presentation, Mike. We will now move to the discussion, which will be moderated by Gillian Tett, Provost of King's College, Cambridge, and co-convener at CEDAR. In addition to Mike, who you've just heard from, I would also like to introduce our other panelists that we have today. To start us off, we have Helen Packen, the Head of Data Intelligence in Market Oversight at the Financial Conduct Authority. We also have Bob Wardrop, co-founder and executive chairman of Reg Genome and management practice professor of finance at the Cambridge Judge Business School and also a co-author. We have Varlam Ebenoitz, head of the FinTech and SupTech Development and Innovation Office at the National Bank of Georgia. And we also have Vitit Sinstaklikul, the digital finance specialist at the Asian Development Bank and co-author. Julian, thank you so much for agreeing to moderating our discussion today. I will let you take it from here.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I should start by saying that this is a truly terrific initiative, and I'm so excited to be part of it. I think if you were to give it a title, it would be Sludge Busters of the World Unite, because essentially what's happening is you're trying to bring together regulators and private sector players to slash the thing that many people hate, as Cass Sunstein said so eloquently when he wrote his book Slush, which is this rising tide of red tape and bureaucratic rules and paperwork. And so it seems to me that this really is one of the areas where AI could potentially deliver a win-win that would make people feel pretty positively about AI, whether they're a regulator or a banker or a consumer of financial services, which is basically everybody. So we've got a terrific panel to talk about this. I don't know if we have the results yet of the poll. Can we show this up on the webinar as we watch it? So reg reporting tops the list, followed by anti-financial crimes compliance and others. Fascinating. So perhaps I can start with you, Michael. As a former top regulator in the US, does this surprise you, the results? And what do you think the implications are?
So actually, this doesn't surprise me. This tracks with a lot of the complaints I've heard from bankers that the reg reporting pain point is quite painful, and the AFC BSA AML is also quite painful. The good news is I think these are really. I love your framing, Jillian. Sludge Busters Unite.
Sludge
Because
Busters of the World Unite. Yes,
right.
I was
Because
being deliberately irreverent there.
yes, well, but it's a great call because both of these require international cooperation. No one regulator by itself can tackle these. They can make progress, they can show the way, but if you really want to get the sludge reduction, there is a degree of regional and international cooperation that's going to be required.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I find fascinating about this current situation is that you say, on the one hand, international cooperation is required. On the other hand, in addition to the three big forms of sludge that you identified, the vertical, the horizontal, and the time-based sludge, of course, there's a fourth type of sludge today, which is geopolitical sludge, if you like, because we've got an era of rising protectionism and nationalism and fragmentation. And whereas regulators used to say we all want to coordinate, and some still do, say in the European Union, in practice that's going backwards. And so that's creating even more sludge because companies have to cope with many different types of national rules, don't they?
Yes. The one thing that really we can change though is to date, almost all these conversations have talked about sludge as this one big blob of stuff
Mm.
that's unwanted. There's no specificity to it. And you mentioned Cass Sunstein. his research is fantastic. It is very much focused on individuals seeking to get government services of some kind. So he's
Yeah.
got an entire taxonomy for that. We need to create our own taxonomy so we can talk about this more precisely. We can measure it. We can hold each other accountable for it. I think that would really change the nature of the discussion.
Absolutely. And of course, a big shining vision that should inspire hope amongst a lot of people is the fact that when this kind of approach was applied by a team at Stanford University with San Francisco municipal government, they then managed to cut the rules by about 36% in a really short space of time. So I'd love to ask you, Robert. I mean, most financiers would be doing a dance on the tables if they thought that the banking rules could suddenly be cut by 36% in the next year. Is that actually feasible, or are there big technical problems? Because, it looks as if one of the problems is that most of the current AI tools, provided, Claude or OpenAI, are actually trained to read conversational literary texts, not the ghastly legalese that you see in regulatory documents. So, is there any way to tackle that, Robert?
Well, I think the binding constraint today to addressing this really isn't AI capability. I mean, the challenge is that rules have no stable digital identity. And I think that's
What
a
does that
really
mean in
important.
what does that mean in English? Because most of us will say, well,
Well, what
rules
it
are there on
means
paper.
is, let's imagine that you use an LLM to reconstruct a law's structure, right, from raw text every time, right? Um, Essentially what you've got is a generative nature of the LLM means that you're going to result in some inconsistency that's a result of the predictive nature of how LLMs work. And if we think of the concept of, particularly if you think about sort of the vertical sludge notion, the stack that derives from standards through laws into regulations into that if you don't start with something that has, high reliability and consistency at the top, at origin, you're just compounding error as you're moving through. So you need something that's been derived from a more deterministic structure to give a label and a description to something with a much higher degree of certainty. And this is why, if you think about the notion, is really can you pre-process and provide descriptors or classify using taxonomies once, where you have consensus and agreement on what the basic structure and descriptors are, so that essentially a model doesn't have to kind of regenerate that every time with some degree of uncertainty based on its probabilistic nature. So it's about stability. It's about having reliable, consistent anchors to then build everything on. So you're not really building on sand, if you understand. Is that helpful?
Yeah, but I mean, but as I understand it, certainly one of the things that Michael Su has argued is that you are getting new types of both legal AI tools, but also technologies, so-called RAG technologies, which can help with that. Is that true? And can you explain to our audience who may not
Well,
be as AI literate as some of you, what that means in practice? Why do we care about this thing called RAG? And is there life beyond, Claude and ChatGPT, or Gemini, etc.?
yes, I think when you start to talk about RAG, you're talking about specially trained models. I think there's a number of different approaches using AI that introduce these, what I would call, stable digital identity reference points, where you can train a small model to use those references, but also you can introduce MCPs, layers of technology that enable foundational LLMs to perform better by anchoring and being able to be pointed towards more concrete references, classifiers, and identifiers than they would find on their own. I think that's
Right.
really the key. And there's an efficiency argument to this, because if you present a complex task for analysis, with a foundational LLM that isn't not a small trained model, or not being able to reference these anchor points, your token burn is huge. And personally, I think organizations are becoming more sensitive to the cost of running these models. And I think as a social issue, this is becoming more important. So I think organizations, whether you're a regulator or whether you're an organization, the notion of being more aligned with societal expectation of environmental efficiency is going to become more and more of an issue.
That's fascinating. So, in a nutshell, what you're saying is that, until now, it's not been that easy to use the existing AI tools with regulatory documents because they are, as you say, unstable in a way, digitally unstable. And it's also potentially very costly. But the good news is that innovations are emerging to make it easier to adapt. And maybe in the future, they'll be less costly as well, both
Yeah.
environmentally and financially.
Yeah, just to close, if you think about what does the machine really need to do, right? And it's really to answer which provisions, which version of the provisions, who does it apply to, and when, right?
Right.
That's the set of anchors that you either need to train a small language model on or provide those identifier anchors, because those are the key sets of questions that need to be answered reliably.
Right. Fascinating. Well, Whitted, I'd like to turn to you on behalf of the Asian Development Bank, because the ADB has put out this fascinating paper that picks up not just on Michael Su's ideas, but the ideas he's been brainstorming with a number of other regulators and economists. And, basically indicates that it's pretty strongly in favor of this line of direction, which is in some ways no surprise, given that Asia is often more innovative in adopting new tech tools than elsewhere in the world. But I'm curious, when you look at those different sludges, vectors, the horizontal, vertical, and time-based sludge, never mind the geopolitical sludge, which do you think is going to be the most important when we look at sort of the ability of sludge busting to help?
Uh, Thank you, Gillian. And first, thank you for having me today. And I think this topic is really relevant to the policymaker across Asia and the Pacific. And the policy slash is not just about the reducing the compliance, it's about the making regulation more effective, and ultimately it's about supporting competitiveness and allow regulator and the private sector to redirect limited resource toward what matter more. And to respond to your question, I actually say it's difficult to separate the three dimension of the slash. And from our experience across the region, slash doesn't accumulate in just one direction, horizontal, either vertical or temporal slash. They reinforce each other and create a knocking on effects, gradually increasing the complexity and cross regulation. And to us, last date on this, let me share first on the temporal slash, the accumulation of the regulation over time, because I think this is where the slash often begins. Today, and the financial sector is evolving quickly, and regulators are responding to the digital finance, AI, tokenization, cybersecurity, financial integrity, and many other emerging issues. And each new risk require policy response, a policy reform, whether that's a new regulation, circular, guidance, notes, supervisory manual, reporting requirement. And I would say each response is well intended and often necessary, because the problem is that we tend to add new layer without reviewing, simplifying, or retiring the old one. Take digital finance as example. Many developing members are now developing framework around the digital asset, and this activity naturally cuts across multiple sectors, so involve several regulators, central bank, capital market regulators, law enforcement, tech authority, FIU, and they touch multiple legal framework, banking, payment act, security, and taxation. And that's where horizontal slash can emerge here. So different regulator may classify, interpret the same product instrument differently because they may have different mandate, policy objective, and take a stable class example. A central bank may see it as a payment instrument. Security capital market regulator may interpret that investment instrument. So both perspectives are understandable given this dynamicity, but they can lead to different requirements for a compliance perspective like disclosure, governance, market conduct, prudential standard. And that I would say that horizontal complexity then create a vertical slash. Each regulator needs to update its own hierarchy of registration, regulation, circular, guidance, reporting template, FAQ, and every layer has to maintain internally consistent. While regulated entity must understand and comply with all of them, inevitably some requirement can and may overlap and other become outdated. So I would say in reality, this dimension don't happen independently. They reinforce each other as a cycle. We found new technology emerge, international standard evolve, for example, FATF, AML-CFT, cybersecurity, prudential, and new safeguard and reporting requirements are introduced. Very few of them disappear. Over time, this complexity compounds across agency, across regulatory stack, and across time. And the good news is that now AI can give us this capability that can turn the ambition to action, and it simply went available for a couple of years ago. But used responsibly with strong governance and human oversight, I think AI can be a real force multiplier for the regulators and supervisors. It can analyze thousands of pages of document, helping authority to identify overlap, inconsistency, outdated provision, and unnecessary complexity. So not just within the one regulators, but it's across multiple agency. So I think I have spoke enough. So I pause here and back to you, Jillian.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. And in essence, what you're saying is that the reason we have this overwhelming sludge is not because anyone's being deliberately malevolent. On the contrary, they're trying to develop good rules and make the financial system safer. And different regulators aren't necessarily being hostile to each other. They're just each developing their own processes and practices quite naturally. But because we have this, structural contradiction between nationally controlled markets in an internationally connected financial system, we get that ever-present clash. Good intentions go bad by mistake. And so it's absolutely fascinating. So I'm curious, I'd like to turn to Helen Packard now from the UK FCA, the British regulators, because even before the advent of AI, you've been making a lot of efforts to try and streamline regulations, and you recently announced that you had essentially helped the industry to save £100 million a year because of these streamlining efforts. Can you tell us, was that done with AI or without AI? And to what degree do you think AI can actually properly scale this?
Thanks, Gillian. I think this was done without AI, but definitely AI is going to be part of the journey going forward. I'm very excited about the concept of the sludge, when we look at policy, because as you say, this policy isn't intended to be in this way. Each policy has a great ambition, but sometimes when you put things together and over time, it's not quite how we want to end up. And it's really interesting about the three types, about horizontal, vertical, and cumulative. So within my area for wholesale markets, we look at gathering huge volumes of data. So, we receive 1 billion rows of data a day.
1 billion rows of data.
1 billion row of data a day. So it's a lot. It's very, very quantitative. It's very important for us to understand stability, market integrity, market abuse. And we use all of that data with, lots of analysis and so forth. But how do we make sure that every element that comes in, we use to the fullest, right? How do we make sure that when we write the rules, it's in the best possible way in the modern era that we are in? And so last year I was looking at the three rules and I said, we have got to really think about these three coming together, which is the same as ESMA and SEC, what time has evolved. So we look particularly at the MiFIR transaction reporting regime and say there's 65 fields. Do we need all of them? Which ones are important? How do they fit into the ecosystem where we get data elsewhere? And through our standard policy rules, we sat there and looked at it and said, actually, we can reduce from 65 to 52 fields. Now, that is part of the consultation, so it's still underway. But we set out in some press release that we intend, if we go forward with the consultation paper into policy, this will save industry £100 million a year from going from 65 to 52. That is one of three regimes that we are looking at. Last week, we had the first industry task force, which is 50 members of different firms in the UK coming together over an 18-month period to discuss how we can improve policy across different perspectives. Strategically, how do we bring them together? Policy, how do we write rules that are thinking horizontally, vertically, and in every way they are sensible and they are modern? And then from an architecture perspective, how do we use technology, data, and AI to the fullest? So three very different conversations, the three conversations that are critical to move us forward. What we don't want to do is do this again in 10 years or whatever. We want to make sure how we think about it today is really setting us up for the future. So it's a really exciting time, but we need to think about all three aspects of policy, strategic aspect, and the technology to make sure that we really address that sludge factor. So, you know, lots to do, but very exciting, Gillian.
That is absolutely fascinating. Can I ask, have you had any pushback in this direction? I mean, at one level, this looks like an absolute win-win-win, which frankly is quite rare in the AI world. But I'm curious, are there any sort of pushback from this?
So we did, during the consultation paper, ask many perspectives on many items, and overwhelmingly we had very positive responses. But as ever, when you engage, there are different perspectives. And we felt that the benefits outweigh the concerns. There will be, as we go forward, many challenges, but sometimes we have to look at those challenges as also opportunities. And I think it's how you look at it and how we navigate a path that is perhaps a path that is palatable to people. And I think that's what we try to do.
Do you ever get, complaints about the environmental cost or the financial cost of all this?
With
AI?
Well, I mean, we, as per se, this isn't about AI for us, right? This is a standard normal tech, shall we say, but what we hope is that AI will help us use the data even more to help us use it for supervisory insights. But it's not necessarily part of this activity.
Okay, that's fascinating. Well, I'd like to ask, Valan Ebenoidze from the Georgian Central Bank, what you make of all this, because, you come from a country that is pretty resource constrained, to put it politely. Are you finding it easy to, find ways to essentially get these types of tools deployed, or is that just too challenging at the moment?
Thank you, Gillian, and a pleasure to be at this stage. Short answer is yes. It could be a leapfrog for a small country like Georgia, but it should be explored. We have proved concepts backed by numbers that the middle corridor, which is key trade route for Georgia, can directly benefit from fintech integration. But the question is how to execute the strategy in real life. You encounter with two challenges, basically. One is technical interoperability, and the other one is regulatory interoperability. So about technical interoperability, more than 100 worldwide have instant payment systems locally. And everyone goes with the standard called ISO 20022. So it's not enough to start dialogue with trade partner and counterparty. You need to think about policy sludge as well, a regulatory interoperability part. And here is where computational regulation come into play. So we tested as a pilot project 2 use cases. One was regarding the open banking. With our key trade partner, we compared the framework of open banking and the technical standards of open banking, and almost 8,000 different items revealed as a difference between those frameworks and standards. This was quite challenging to do with human intervention, with limited resources, supervisory resources we have in this country. And you can multiply this to other trade partners in the middle corridor. And it's a huge work. And computational regulation helps you to have agenda for conversation with your trade partner. When you approach your trade partner about integration of open banking or integration of instant payment system, they would ask, what is the price of the question? So what is the starting point? And machine computation, and in this case, Regom does a good job to have agenda starting point for conversation. We have initial reports in our hands to show to our trade partners what are the gaps between our open banking regulations and standards, and how we can potentially close those gaps. Another use case we have tested related to AML, and it's quite well-known fact that only 1 to 3% of all illicit transactions globally are caught by current compliance systems. That's Interpol numbers.
Wow.
So they are hugely inefficient, yes. And one of the reasons of such an inefficiency is related to data sharing between countries in a real online manner. But I believe besides this technical interoperability, regulatory fragmentation and policy sludge also is the reason for such an inefficiency. And that's why we have prioritized the AML use case in our pilot project to have sense what it takes us to have transactions with our trade partners. You need to think about AML rule differences. And the solution for technical interoperability is in privacy-enhancing technologies. So homomorphic encryption or zero-knowledge proof are those technologies when you can share the information without actually revealing this information. This could be a solution of partly solution, but also comes regulatory interoperability. And this task is tested in Project Aurora under BIS Innovation Hub. This homomorphic encryption, it's like a paradigm shift in cryptography from communication encrypted data to computation over encrypted data. And I think it's a good analogy for computational regulation as well. It's paradigm shift from human read and machine read towards machine composable and in the end, what is final destination, machine executable. So you need both to summarize, to think about technical interoperability as well as about regulatory interoperability. And this regulatory interoperability task is executed by machine computational regulation. We have pilot results in place, and we will see, but the pilot results are quite optimistic in core use cases. So to summarize, yes, such a tool, especially for a small country with limited resources, could have a leapfrog effect, considering also the fact that we are not part of multilateral projects like Aperta or Aurora. We have observer place in best case scenario. For small countries, it's vital to have such a tool in place in order to start negotiating with your trade partners on a bilateral basis some opportunities for fintech integration. And for Georgia, again, it's a vital issue because middle corridor is a strategic importance for the country, and everything which would assist and bring additional competitive advantage into middle corridor, including the fintech integration, including the cleaning up the policy sludge between trade partners. It's very, very important for the country.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. And your point about the fact that smaller and less resourced countries can potentially use this to help leapfrog and tackle their ever-expanding burdens is incredibly important. I'm curious, though, I'd like to turn to Robert now and say that, of course, one of the things that AI can potentially do in the face of all this policy sludge is create a lot more consistency in the rules around the world. But does that run the risk of, creating too much uniformity and knocking out some of the diversity, which can often be a good thing. I mean, think back to 2007, the financial crisis then. Andy Haldane from the Bank of England wrote a brilliant piece pointing out that, just as the Amazon rainforest can look really robust from the outside because it's got lots of big tall trees, the fact that all the trees are pretty much growing in exactly the same way, in the same type of adaptation techniques to the ecosystem, means that if something goes wrong, they all fall over. And he pointed out that that happened during the 2007 financial crisis with private sector companies that are all adapted to the environment in exactly the same way. Are you at all concerned, Robert, that this could happen as a result of computational regulation smoothing out the differences and making everything a bit more uniform?
This is such a key issue, because I think when you start to think about, if you accept the premise that structured data is a sort of a necessary condition to moving forward with computational regulation and some notion of standardization, you're into the world of talking about ontologies and taxonomies. And at the end of the day, these are social concepts. They aren't technical concepts, because essentially they're constructed by preference. They're designed to kind of reflect the classification criteria of how we all view the world. And so you start getting into issues of sovereignty. You start getting into issues of, cultural and societal difference that results in laws, that result in regulation differences. So the risk here, if you don't have a process by which you have very broad consensus on standardizing the description of a policy, but not the policy itself. That's key. You need to separate the description from the wording of the policy. That enables that sort of flexibility, that sovereignty at the policy level. And if that structure doesn't reflect diversity, then what happens when you start to look at things like you get what we would call kind of you kind of get harmonization by stealth. In other words, you'll have this structure, you'll do sludge analysis, and you'll identify anomalies, and those anomalies will be seen as negatives, and so everyone will be pressured somehow to converge on what that standard is, which is actually eroding sovereignty and not reflecting. So the issue you're raising, Gillian, is really, really huge. And I think this process by which you arrive at agreed structures of ontology and taxonomy classification is underappreciated of how important that is as a starting point to preserve sovereignty. I
That's
see
fascinating.
Wittit's nodding a bit, but this is really key, and I don't think it has enough visibility.
Right, that's absolutely fascinating. I should say I trained as a cultural anthropologist, and in fact, my second to last book was about the fact that taxonomies and classification systems are fundamentally a cultural phenomenon, as you say. And in many ways, one of the best definitions of culture is classification, and classification
Yes.
is culture. I mean, that's absolutely core to who we are as human beings. And, the natural world shows so many examples, not just in the Amazonian rainforest, that if you don't have diversity, you reduce resilience of a system overall, which is just so critically important. But perhaps I could jump ahead to Witty and ask him, you were nodding, would you agree? Because I can't imagine that, your countries want to be exactly the same as a place like Denmark, to put it randomly, because there are big cultural differences. Oops. Having been nodding, maybe he's vanished. Oh, well. Okay. Well, in that case, let's turn instead to Varlan from the Central Bank of Georgia and ask you that, yes, we need diversity. We also need some element of human oversight. And everyone keeps saying, yes, 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 we're going to keep a human in the loop. But, is that just going to be a box ticking exercise or something more?
Yes, from practical example, we need human oversight in place. AI is not replacing human judgment. And based on our examples, the use cases we have tested, first you start the process with the enriching of model with your data. so we have compared in AML use case our policies versus best practice and FAT recommendations. To say more specifically, we have compared the questionnaires for politically exposed persons and the scores given by Georgian banks with their peers in Western world. And you need to enrich the model with Georgian legislation as much as possible. Otherwise, you can have cases of false negatives. So you cannot identify gaps fully. And in the middle of exercise, when you have this technical report and gaps identified, you have issues related to language. So Georgia is a low resource language. Not many people speak in Georgian. So the model is not trained in Georgian as much as in English. So you might have need for domain expertise to identify in this place false positives, whether it is really issue and gap or it's kind of language minor language related minor mistake or gap. So
Right.
yes, human intervention and human judgment is still much needed.
Right. But then that then raises a question, and maybe Helen can answer this, about, if we have human judgment involved and yet machines are doing most of the work here, who has the blame if something goes wrong? Because, lawyers are scrambling right now about responsibility around AI tools. Some of you may have seen the wonderful piece that Yuval Harari wrote the other day in the FT about Argentina's attempt to give legal personhood to AI models, which opens the way for them also, of course, to be sued, but also protected. And that's a step too far for many people right now. So, what is your thinking, Helen, about what happens if something goes wrong?
Thank you, Gillian. It's very timely. Earlier in the week, the FCA published a paper called AI in the Future of Retail Financial Services, which leads on a significant piece of research over the last few months. And whilst it is predominantly looking at retail financial services, it did set out in the paper that, moving away from a human-led towards an AI-enabled and delegated environment. And whilst consumer adoption is depending on trust, control, and access, they are quite open to letting AI make decisions for them. But this is a path which we're all on together. We're not necessarily further down the line. We're all learning at the same. So it makes it complicated for us. But one of the interesting things from a regulator is there were 3 points that are very noteworthy in this conversation. One of the key findings is that existing regimes remain effective for assistive AI, but some of our regimes come under strain as systems move towards human as the kind of the approver, an observer. And so that changes the dynamic of the decision making. And it changes how we supervise. So whilst AI helps give opportunities, it does create a different ecosystem of who takes risks, who's making the decisions, how these all come together and those behaviors and when they're kind of, amplified and what actually happens when we look from the outside in. So I think, where I'm particularly interested is how we can use agentic AI to help us supervise, but we need to do it within our risk appetite, within our legal framework, within our understanding. And that takes time, but we also don't have that much time because technology is changing really fast and we have significant opportunity to reduce the regulatory burden. So we need to sort of evolve, but evolve in a way that we feel authentic, comfortable, and a little bit ambitious.
Right.
So I think it's kind of a combination, really, of how do we work in partnership with AI.
Right. That's fascinating. That also raises a question about governance. Whittit, what do you think are the best, I mean, examples of governance that you can see? And, what can we learn from that?
Yes, thank you. So, well, from what I've seen across Asia, I think many regulators recognize the existing of the policy slashes is a real issue, and some central bank have done something. As for example, setting up the governance mechanism or cross-functional task force to regularly review, assess the existing compliance and reporting requirement, and also before introducing the new ones. A practical that I find particularly useful is what I call a one-in-one review approach. Whenever a new reporting requirement is proposed, the regulator first review existing one to see whether it can be simplified, consolidated, or retired. The objective isn't deregulation, it's making sure that compliance remain proportionate. That around regulated entities spend more time and relocate resource serving customer and innovating rather than simplifying the report. And it's also effective way to stop the regulatory burden from quietly accumulating over time.
Mm.
And I would say the difficulty, of course, is that it's much easier said than done. You are reviewing reporting template, massive of data field, supervisory manual, circular, document across multiple departments within the same organization, and also sometimes across multiple regulators. And doing that manually can take months, which make continuous review almost impossible. So this is where I think AI can turn, again, regulatory ambition into practical action. AI is a force multiplier. It can review 1,000 of documents, identify and flag overlapping reporting requirement, highlight inconsistency, and also outdated provision at a speed and scale that simply wasn't feasible before. But I would want to highlight here that technological alone isn't enough to deliver the real supervisory outcome. AI adoption needs to be anchored in the practical governance, supported by the human oversight and strong infrastructure. And I would like to go into detail for this. For first, the product governance, what we have seen, the good practice is it needs multidisciplinary accountability. AI can surface potential issue, but it shouldn't be making decision on its own. You need legal expert, policymakers, supervisor, data specialist, and where appropriate input from the private sector. And bringing these different perspectives together lead to better informed decision and more balanced regulatory outcome or at the ecosystem level. And second piece, human oversight is absolutely essential. Experts need to validate the finding, separate the genuine issue from the false positive, apply legal supervisory context that AI simply doesn't understand on its own based on the context, especially in our developing member country. So the feedback can help improve and refine the model over time, making it more accurate, more reliable, and more buy-in from the regulators. And finally, what I think is really important as well is what I call a confident infrastructure. AI is only as good as the regulatory data is built on, and data need to be accurate, up to date, and traceable to the original source. And because this output may influence a regulatory decision and outcome, the model needs to meet a much higher standard hurdle than a general purpose AI, especially when it comes to minimize the false positive and also explainable results. And I think I would like to highlight here on the in terms of ADB perspective, this is particularly important for developing member country. So many regulatory framework and document are multilingual, highly context specific, different arrangement, or exist only a scanned document where inconsistent OCR quality. So before AI can generate reliable insight, there's often a groundwork to do, improving the quality of the document, digitizing regulatory material, and building trust on the regulatory data set. And at the end of the day, the principle is the same. Quality in, quality out. The better the data, the stronger the governance, and the more confident I think regulator can have in using AI to make better regulatory outcome. So I think the three principles here, very, very fundamental, and it's the thing that we have seen across the Asia, not because of AI, but because of the building up of the compliance that they have to suffer from them. And yeah, this is what I would highlight from across the Asia and Pacific. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed. I think you were very tactful when you said quality of data in, quality of data out. Many people say garbage in, garbage out. So let's hope it's not garbage either way. But I mean, obviously, as you say, the problem with Asia is that it is fragmented and it's often been sort of caught between the Chinese and American different regimes and is trying to navigate between that or other regimes as well. But I'm curious, there is a bigger question here, more existential, Helen, which is that the UK has been banging the drum for ages about the importance of global coordination and global standards. Do you think that computational regulation is actually going to help with that process? Or will it actually make people go, oh, we don't need to bother, the AI programs will do it for us?
I think it is a subject that's very close to my heart. When I used to work for the Bank of England, I was privileged to have the responsibility to lead the Bank for International Settlements fintech chair. So that meant I worked with lots of different central banks on their supervisory technology initiatives. And there is so much need and want for collaboration, for do it once, do it well. If I say potato, somebody should say potato, but let's just all call it potato, or whatever vegetable you would prefer. But it is really important that we do share, and IOSCO is a key aspect for us. But I think there's two ways that we think about standards. There is the very obvious communication, such as the transatlantic task force with the US and the UK. There are different initiatives that are very public. But there's also a lot that is very private, and that just happens at a working level, how we share our information and how regulators talk to regulators. And, the relationships that we have are very vast and deep, that we've known colleagues for many years that may sit in very different jurisdictions around the world. And we always just try to talk and say, we're thinking this. Should we define it like that? Oh, well, you define it like that. We need to think international. Our worlds operate on an international basis. And I think, how we can help not just regulate and supervise, but how we can help industry call it once the same thing really does help. And as we go further and further to use technology, how we can ensure that we call ideally things the same things will help with the adoption and exploitation of the information even more as we enhance the use of AI. But it's all about partnership, right? And that collaboration. And I think that's really important. The tech will help, but, is a human very much in the loop here.
Right. That's fascinating. I mean, Michael, given that we basically need shared ontologies and common data standards, you said, to make computational tools actually work, how does all this square with this rising sense of, protectionism, nationalism, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, is there any way to kind of resolve that kind of tension, do you think?
Yeah, so I think that protectionism is symptomatic of a broader obstacle to all of this, which is inertia. Like, this is by far, you had said before, it seems win-win. Why don't we just do it? We're not just going to do it because there are many people who they've grown up doing the same things. And this is not a knock on individuals, but we have a lot of processes in place that are going to be very hard to change. Simple example, I was part of a project once where two different jurisdictions, do we report 1 week or 5 days? There were endless meetings about whether those fields should be 1 week versus 5 days. That's a tiny example. That exists many places. No reconciliation, two different reports. That doesn't make sense. Like, things like that should just be, we should say potato. I agree with Helen. Make a call, move forward. But we rely a lot on these interactive processes, consensus building, that's very slow, doesn't scale. I think what we need to do going forward is prototype. Because it's a very different conversation when you have something to work with. You have a miniature outcome, you're working with it, you're playing with it. Suddenly this discussion is different. It's not a, do you win, do I win? I'm working with now a thing that either it works better or it doesn't. And, I know CDER is sponsoring a hackathon now. I highly encourage, if you talk about sandboxes and hackathons, I do think in the future, prototyping compresses consensus building. because consensus building takes forever. It takes a long time. But if you're now playing with different toys, different versions of this, you can now skip to saying, hey, that works better. Let's do that. And I think that can both capture the imagination, it can have us build things rather than defend things. I think this is part of the mindset switch that we're going to have to do.
So as you say, just quickly before I move on to the others, you know, I mean, as you say, really the problem is bureaucratic cultural impediments, to put it crudely. So given that those are so strong, do you still believe that computational regulation really can work to streamline or AI like
Yeah,
this?
absolutely. And to be clear, the bureaucratic is on both sides. I was talking to a treasurer at a bank about
Yeah.
liquidity code, machine readable, and she was saying, well, we've invested all this time. I have all these armies of people. This is what they do. And yeah, we could do that. Other idea is great, but I'd have to deal with all the internal politics, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I think the way to overcome a lot of this is to build a preview of the thing to show everybody, this works
Demonstration effect. And you
exactly.
really do believe that it can streamline regulations or do sludge busting, red tape reduction, etc.
It's hard to argue with something that works. Like it's not a conversation. It's like a
Mm.
live thing that you have to build something better.
Right, right. Interesting. Well, Varlan, from the point of view of Georgia, again, you're in a difficult geopolitical position, a bit of a hotspot, one might say. You're caught between different types of spheres of influence. So when you think about computational regulation in that context, is that just another burden to have to deal with?
Yes, thank you. That's true. We operate in quite complex environment, including from geographic point of view. I think computational regulation is pretty much can be seen ally for us to achieve our fintech development objectives. On one hand, we are for years now candidate country in the EU. We are harmonizing our regulation with the EU for years. And on the other hand, we are quite proactively sending use case driven letters to our counterparties in Central Asian countries. So what does it mean? Use case driven letter is like we are identifying the possible opportunities in fintech, for example, digital onboarding of clients, which could be relevant from Central Asian countries, because Georgia is becoming a trade hub from European and US cars, then exporting to Central Asian countries, and those guys need basic account services in Georgia. If you can have APIs integrated between Georgian bank and Central Asian banks securely through cross-border open banking, then it illustrates the added value for the real economy. But this use case-driven dialogue can be escalated to the next level only if you have in place some detailed comparison. And here is where computational regulation plays the role. So we are having a bridge concept between the EU and Central Asia. And I think the computational regulation and the tool which would practically clean up the policy sludge between the EU and the Central Asia, for us, it's pretty much needed tool, and it will help us to further position ourselves as a bridge between the EU regulations and Central Asian countries. And our key message for the fintech investor is not to come to 4 million country, which is very much already developed in terms of banking, but to have opportunity to start banking products here. And because we would have sometime the good integrations with the Central Asian countries when it comes to technology as well as regulatory interoperability, Georgia would be a starting point to reach wider 200 million region.
Right, that's fascinating. Thank you. I mean, Whitted, as our, you're also representing a lot of emerging market countries and countries caught between big powers and trying to act like bridges. What is the actual application right now? I mean, the potential future applications sound amazing, but can this actually be used right now?
Yes, okay.
Yes.
Uh,
Well, that's a resounding yes from both Varlan and from Whitted.
yeah.
Whitted, explain what's actually happening right now.
Yes, I have to say, this new regulatory analysis too are very timely and promising, especially for many of our developing members. I would say they're trying to do several things as one, implement financial sector reform, compliant with an expanding set of international standards, and at the same time, supervise a rapidly changing financial system. The challenge is that many regulators have limited capacity and resource, and they are expected not only to ensure compliance, but to keep pace with the emerging risks, like what I mentioned, cybersecurity, digital and scam. And let me take you practical example from our work in the Pacific. We as the ADB working with the regional, the regulatory technology to strengthen the regulatory capacity of the 14 Pacific member country. The objective is to ensure that authority align with international standards and FATF, OECD, NIST. And this is more than just a compliance exercise. It is strategically important because meeting this standard, meaning that it could ensure financial inclusion, financial integrity, and cyber resilience in many Pacific economy. So the challenge these authorities face is that the regulatory material are often fragmented across law, regulation, supervisory guidance, enforcement action, and policy document. So instead of asking supervisor to review these thousands of pages of document, the platform systemically organize all this material into a structured format and it compare them against international standard, identify what is the gap, highlight what is inconsistency, and do this across multiple jurisdiction and multiple different authority in the functional term. And of course, I think trust in the result is essential. This is why every finding is fully need to testable back to the original source document through data provenance and renewed, and the final output will be reviewed and validated by respective authority. So in terms of the results of the pilot, we found that the task that previously took regulatory team several weeks of manual analysis can now be completed it just within an hour. We're now moving the next step to assess the supervisory effectiveness and we'll benchmark against the international standard and we generate the gap assessment report. And the feedback from the central bank across the Pacific is very positive because they see this as a way to strengthen the supervisory capability given the limited resource. And I would like to highlight two important challenge here. One is that you mentioned international standards are constantly evolving. It's not static. As new risks continue to emerge, the platform cannot remain static. So the methodology, the underlying data, the analytical model, training model need to be continuously updated so that the output will remain relevant and reliable. And finally, and importantly, I'd like to emphasize that technology is only part of the solution. The biggest challenge when we talk about the developing member in terms of regulators, the biggest challenge is building the institutional capacity, how to embed these two into day-to-day supervisory effort. Regulator needs skill, governance, and confidence to use these two effectively and practically. And importantly, to combine this insight, you need human judgment. And that I would say, ultimately, this is where the real value will come to make the impact across in our clients. I think,
Right,
yes, thank you.
that's fascinating. So at the end of the day, it's you can't expect AI to be a magic wand. It relies on us basically creating the right institutions and training people in the right way, effectively. Yeah, well,
Yes,
therein
right.
lies the challenge for us all. But we're almost out of time. But Robert, I'd like to come back to you. I mean, you created Reg Genome because you were so convinced that this is going to be the future. What is it going to look like in 5 years' time? Do you think we'll actually have it in place and be slashing red tape left, right, and center, a bit like San Francisco City Hall?
I think we'll have this interoperability structures that enable the interoperability are going to be essential because the geopolitical forces are not going to diminish.
Mm.
And on the other hand, Like the big, to me, elephant in the room thing here is financial market infrastructure is evolving because tokenization is coming.
Yeah.
Tokenization fundamentally is going to need computational regulation.
Yes.
And everyone's figured out how to make a buck from tokenization. So
Yes.
this isn't just about cost saving, this is about revenue generating. And this
Mm.
is industry is going to be pushing hard for this. So I think Varlam, like if you think about it, and so Varlam and Michael have made really interesting points about institutional resistance and the challenges of emerging and developing economies, and that this leapfrog opportunity is there. I think Michael and his conversations with the treasurer of the bank, I've had similar conversations. I sat in a round table because we do work with regulators on supporting their efforts to create machine readable rule books. And so we hold roundtables with industry to get their views on this. And I've had some of the biggest banks in the world, representatives of those banks, sitting in roundtables where actually what machine readability can deliver, actually they can't even ingest because of their processes and the changes that would be required and how they do things now, which is really to Michael's point. But if those same institutions start to realize that that's a barrier to making big money with tokenization, they're going to force those changes internally.
Absolutely. Well, listen, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you all very much indeed. I mean, I take away three key points myself. One is that regulated sludge is indeed a huge 21st century curse that's getting worse and worse at the moment, not just because of rapid financial sector change, but also because of the geopolitical problems, which, as you've just said, Robert, are not going to improve by themselves anytime soon, unfortunately. Secondly, AI does hold out this extraordinarily exciting opportunity to have a tool to fight back against the sludge, to go forward and sludge bust, as people say. And if anyone's not looked at what happened in San Francisco, they should do, because that's a really encouraging example of how it could be put into practice. Whether it would work in finance on quite the same scale and speed, I don't know, but it's a really exciting example. But the third point that's come up over and over again is that it's not going to be fixed just by deploying AI as a magic wand. And that's not because of technological problems. They are there, but they can be dealt with. The question about the stability of data sets and things. It's really about institutional capability and humans and culture. As I say, as someone who trains as a cultural anthropologist, but has always been fascinated by finance and money, I love that point. It explains why we need to employ AI alongside critical thinking and an awareness of culture. Or to use the tagline I often use, artificial intelligence needs a second type of AI called anthropology intelligence to create the right type of AI, which is augmented intelligence. And I think if we use word augmented intelligence more regularly, it probably would help to get a much more constructive conversation. But anyway, it just remains for me to say a huge thank you to all of you, Michael, Bob, Helen, Varlan, and Wittet. And I'll now toss back to Siddharth to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jillian, and a sincere thanks to everyone on this panel for such a rich and candid discussion. And thanks to all of the members of the audience that joined in today to participate in the conversation. A lot of what we discussed forms the critical substrate as you move into a world where we imagine trillions of agents autonomously interacting with each other and thinking about how do you computationally represent and also enable regulation, supervision, and enforcement is really critical. This brings us to an end of today's forum. Before I close, though, I would like to bring your attention to a few upcoming CEDAR initiatives, particularly one I'm most excited about, which is the CEDAR Hackathon. I will now ask Hugo Coelho, Director of Policy at CEDAR, to cover these. Over to you, Hugo.
Thank you so much, Siddharth. So yes, I would like to say a few words about CEDAR Hackathon, which we launched today and we're very excited about. This is a flagship initiative designed to support regulators in developing agentic AI tools for policymaking, for regulation, for supervision. It is, to our knowledge, the first of its kind, and responds to what we see as the growing interest from public authorities in the practical use of AI. I suspect many of you have read the Mills review report that came out this week and which makes this point precisely. We're delivering the hackathon in partnership with the BIS, with GIFIN, with the RCF, and with the support of a number of partners, including Google, the Networks for Humanity, and International, and SWIFT. So we strongly encourage you to participate. You can register by scanning the QR code on the left-hand side of the slide. We have 6 problem spaces or 6 challenges for you, covering areas such as fraud, financial advice, and agentic payments. The preliminary assessment round runs until the 21st of July, and the prize pool is 100K USD. Thank you again for joining us today. We'll now close the session, but we look forward to seeing you at future CDER events. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone.